Chapter 3 from New Light. Chapter 3. A flash of orange, a rush of air, and a trail of flying leaves. The lightfox propelled Anniya through the moonlit trees. Anniya applied back pressure on the harness handle, giving a tug to increase the tension. Spirit sent a surge of impulse down the rope, lurching them forward to violent speeds. As they flew furiously over the tops of the ferns and bushes, Anniya watched the little fox on the end of the rope. He whipped through the jungle with blinding speed, flitting, jumping, and leaping through holes and openings in the plant life without leaving a single paw print or moving a blade of grass. He didn't even disturb the leaves floating on the surface of the puddles. Not a ripple. At least, not until Anniya and her floatboard came rushing after. Behind her protective glasses, Anniya's eyes darted around, following the zipping lightfox as branches, vines, and small trunks swished by on all sides in a blurry, violent procession. She looked away from the lightfox, back ahead, just in time to get slapped in the face. The broad, wet, and heavy leaf bent as it pushed against her glasses and the bridge of her nose, its thick green stalk flexing until it broke, folding into a kink with sharp corners, one of which drew straight across her left cheek, slicing a thin, clean cut. 3 little drops of blood dripped out from the small slash, the high-speed wind blowing them into trickles, little red rivers that forked back towards her left ear to get absorbed by her hair and the edge of her tightly drawn hood. Teeth clenched, nostrils flared, Anniya eased her grip on the handle. The rope dimmed as they slowed to a stop on the edge of a clearing of dry, hard-packed dirt. Spirit stood in place, wearing his harness, and looking around the large opening in the jungle without much interest. Placing one foot down on the bare ground for balance, keeping the other foot up on the floatboard, Anniya used her free left hand to open and throw back her hood. Then, holding her hand in front of her face, a small point of dim light appeared out from her palm between her fingers. The dim point grew, expanding into a disc-shaped mirrored surface. The floating mirror in her hand glowed, illuminating her face as she examined her cheek. The glowing disc vanished, and she closed her eyes, taking in a long, slow breath, then holding it. As she held her breath in silence, around her the lively jungle rang and chirped. Gradually she let out her breath, and when she opened her eyes, they glinted as though reflecting some unseen source of bright cyan light. Anniya peeled away a few stuck hairs from her cheek as she moved her sparkling gaze around the thick overgrowth that ringed the edge of the dirt clearing. Like a shattered mirror reflecting a sunbeam, her glinting eyes cast flecks of sky blue light out across the hard-packed ground and onto the far plants and trees. When the light of her eyes fell upon a dense wall of overgrowth far on the other side of the clearing, she stopped scanning, and she stopped turning. The cyan twinkle vanished from her hazel eyes as she gave a gentle tug on Spirit's harness. Pulled by a trotting Spirit, Anniya coasted on her floatboard across the dirt clearing, all the way over to the far side where the plants and vines made a dense wall. She hopped off her board and let go of the harness. The board hovered in place while the rope twisted slowly in the air, still strapped to the lightfox, who was now sitting. Spirit watched Anniya stalking off into the thick ferns and trunks, her palms glowing with a shining green light. At her touch, plants bent away, vines parted, and small trees bowed down, falling, drooping, almost melting as they made a verdant path for her. Amid the chirping of the night jungle, Anniya's plant pushing added a creaking shushing to the ringing jungle night. Pushing aside a thick meshing of ferns, she paused, staring at the ground with a small smile. There you are. The light from her hands vanished, and she reached down into the darkness between the bent-away ferns. Her hands fidgeted in the shadows for a few moments before bringing up into the moonlight a handful of red berries. They popped between her fingers, oozing out a red, watery syrup. Applying the syrup to the cut on her cheek, rubbing it in well, Anniya washed away dried streaks of blood. As she walked back out of the thick brush into the moonlit dirt clearing, the plants behind her stood back up, ferns rising to mesh back together, and trunks unbending back to their original vertical positions. Digging around in her satchel, Anniya withdrew a small towel. She wiped the berry syrup and blood mixture from her cheek as she looked up at the surrounding treetops. Now, where is that big tree? She placed the towel back into her satchel. Were we going too fast? Did we pass it? Anniya strolled out into the center of the large dirt clearing, then stood there under the starry sky, turning slowly as she scanned the tree line around the edge of the clearing. She stopped turning, grinned, then pointed. There it is, right there. Spirit, now sitting at Anniya's feet, no longer wearing the harness, looked up to see what she was pointing at. Above the treetops, on the far side of the clearing, in the distance, he saw the crown of a great tall tree against the stars, its massive upper branches spanning out above the forest. Anniya returned from the middle of the clearing, hiking over to retrieve her floatboard and the rope floating beside it. With her right hand, she grabbed the floating rope by the handle and twirled it around her forearm, winding it in out of the air. She placed her right foot onto the floatboard, the crystals beneath shining brighter as they pushed more weight against the ground. Then, with her left foot, she gave a few kicks to coast her over to the other side of the clearing. When she reached the wall of dense overgrowth, while still in motion, she hopped off the board and stomped on its tail to kick it up in front of her where, in a single practice motion, she snatched the floatboard out of the air and slung it over her shoulder where it snapped securely to a hard point on her backpack. With both hands now free, she held them up to the dense wall of overgrowth and blazed forth green light from her palms. The plant life glowed in sympathy, moving aside and pushing back in a rustling hush to form a tunnel-like corridor. With her hands out in front of her, she entered. As she moved away down the corridor deeper into the overgrowth, the entrance to the living tunnel began to close behind her. Soon, like a candle in a woven basket, only dim little patches of her light could be glimpsed through the crisscrossing branches and vines. Then, eventually, as she sank further away and more of the overgrowth closed behind her, even those last dim patches faded away. The wall of plant life stood motionless and silent amid the ringing jungle, the open dirt clearing dark and empty beneath the full moon. And that's chapter 3.